to you once again. It's a great opportunity to continue this collaboration, this conversation, and co-construction of products and processes together in our two regions. So our presentation today is focused on just to provide a quick context on where we are in the UNFCCC process that can help you to consider from the views of the research teams, the opportunities that you have, as well as Sarah mentioned, and all the other focal points could have the opportunity to see, which is the according to your national context and the international opportunities in the UNFCCC process, which is the best fit for your current outcome. So just a very quick reminder, adaptation is everywhere in the Paris Agreement. So that helps us to understand that why the adaptation-related documents are many, and which are the relationship between them. This is a quick reminder that these are some of the most important processes happening together, the UNFCCC right now, and that will have are important now and will continue to be critical next years. So a first feature that I want to mention, and in the next slide probably it will be even clear why we are making focus on this. All what we do, we understand that is related to the adaptation policy cycle. So this is the way in which the convention worked for decades on adaptation, and all your research was focusing one moment in particular of the adaptation policy cycle, the diagnosis, the vulnerability and risk assessment. So now all these other parts of the story are quite obviously linked to, so sorry, my daughter. Yeah. So coming back, all these other parts of the story are quite related to this adaptation policy cycle. Formally are going there, all of them. The BTRs, I remember Gabriela mentioned already this. We have a very clear opportunity on the BTR submission for next year. And we will have, I will mention the relationship between these adaptation policy cycle with this reporting instrument in particular, as well as with the other, and how this collective process, the GST, which first cycle finished this year, and the GGA, that is the global goal on adaptation discussion, also fit all these conversations. So this is just a slide for you to have some taste on how this conversation that we are having on a moment and specific needs and gaps in one moment of the adaptation policy cycle can really fit everywhere. All the conversations that we are having, not only, of course, an adaptation-related document, such as the BTR and others that we will reflect on in a minute, but also the processes that are happening. So for sure, you have many opportunities from Bonn session for COP28 and next year to continue trying to see how this input better fits the conversations. So, as I said before, the adaptation policy cycle is the seed of the whole thing. So we see that finally the objective is to support implementation. Many times when we see, okay, why I am preparing all these documents, why we have all these, the national communications, the adaptation communications, the NAPs, the biennial transparency report, the NDCs, the long-term strategies, is quite a lot. So for everyone at the national level, I mean, negotiators, for sure, research teams, is very simple and logic, I mean, to say why we need all these documents. Well, if our national process at home is solid, is clear, if we build this iterative adaptation policy cycle and we understand very well what we are doing, which are the objectives, which are our needs, and which capacities we need to strengthen. So if that is the case, then we will be able to communicate and report on adaptation in a more efficient way, and also to make that story more cohesive in terms of how these different instruments relate between themselves, because then what is happening is that we are repeating things among the different instruments. So this is also very important for you to take the big picture. Is the big picture at the UNFCCC process, the moment that we are right now, as well as your own national moment. So we know that some countries already have their NAPs, some others don't have their NAPs, some already submit adaptation communications. So I mean, you need to identify which is the moment of your own country, and to see which are the opportunities in terms of what the country is already preparing, the opportunities for the future, the invitations that you have in order to submit, such as the BTR for next year and the ABTR in particular, and that's the adaptation component of the BTR. But at the same time, how that relates also at the international process with other conversations, such as the GST mentioned by Sarah, and the global goal on adaptation, also as many other conversations on finance. So this is for you to consider that when we see there are of these different documents, these 6 adaptation-related documents, we have in some cases guidelines already there for national communications, in particular non-Annex 1 parties. We have also a guidance of the adaptation communication in Decision 9 CMA1. And we also have a guidance on the MPGs on transparency framework, including the adaptation component of the BTR in Decision 18 CMA1. There are other adaptation-related documents where we don't have a specific guidelines for submissions, but we have the different documents that help us to prepare these, such as the NDCs, that there are many decisions talking about mitigation component and also on adaptation, NAPAs, as well as all the guidelines prepared by the LEG on the preparation on NAPs. That is not only the document, but the process, as we all know. So here, we are seeking to understand that the objectives of our research are everywhere in the adaptation-related documents. So you will see that only considering the national communications, we already have vulnerability and risk assessment as a big part from the very beginning. We also have different parts of our research objectives in the adaptation communications guidance, that is impacts, risk, and vulnerabilities, but also implementation and support needs. So sorry. Okay, and as well as the implementation of adaptation actions and plans. This element in particular in Annex is as like 5 other sub-elements, and one of them is barriers, challenges, and gaps. So this is also an opportunity, as well as the inclusion of gender-responsive adaptation action and traditional knowledge as an element, but also as a cross-cutting consideration for many countries. When we see the MPGs for the preparation and submission of the BTRs, we may also see the impacts, risk, and vulnerabilities, the adaptation priorities and barriers. So what we want to say here is that what you already prepare is has the potential to be part of all the adaptation-related documents. So it's up to the focal point with the national research teams to agree which is the best moment, and we are considering the international context, the invitations that we have, such as the BTRs, but also your national context, because maybe you just submitted an NDC, so it's not the moment because of the cycle. Maybe you are preparing an adaptation communication, so that is amazing, that's an opportunity. So you need to all together to identify which are the best opportunities in order to see where this product, these amazing outcomes that you already have there can fit. What we want to say is that it's for you to decide, but the opportunities are all, because all the instruments include what you already had. So is more about that. Again, to be even more clear on this regard, to say that when we compare the type of information in all the adaptation-related documents, you will see that these areas of interest as part of your research process, again, are part of most of the documents. So for sure, through examples that we are going to provide, you will see how countries are already doing so. So there are some examples that help us to understand that in some countries, according to the instrument or the document or the vehicle that you decide to use, for sure, maybe you consider, no, well, I can include this in the impacts, risk, and vulnerabilities because it makes sense. Because then when I talk about gaps and needs, I just do it from a financial perspective and not from this view. So that's not so well, I prefer it here. Or no, I can get it in support needed and received, as for example, a BTR, and that's a perfect place because I can talk about all my gaps, all my needs as a process and adaptation iterative policy cycle. So that is up to you how you build that story. And we understand that that is the best that you can build with your national focal point in order to build that narrative together. And that the next steps that you provide as national research teams are agreed with the national focal point. So we would like to give you some examples. Before giving and going to Ignacio for doing so, just let me tell you that in order to give this, to select these examples, which were the bases, the things that we look for. The idea was to look for very recent adaptation-related documents, and with these adaptation-related documents, to check which countries are already communicating and or reporting on gaps and needs that are focused on the same moment that your research may focus. That means on the vulnerability and risks assessment as part of the diagnosis. So you can see in some cases as a narrative, how that is related to the document. So you will see in the slide, in this case, we included, of course, the link, because then you will have access to the presentation. We will send it. You will see which is the document, for example, just to let you know the sense is, for example, an adaptation communication, if it's a national communication, if it's a national adaptation plan, and which is the specific part of the document where this was included. So you can also have a taste on how this country understood that these specific gaps and needs could fit. I will go to Ignacio so he can explain a little bit more the examples.
Thank you, Pilar, and it's good to see you all. Really to see how the work has evolved, and also the different areas where you have also presented your work and have been doing it forward. Looking into the examples that we work with Pilar, again, as she has indicated, she just indicated, the idea was to extract, and perhaps some of these documents are 30 pages, some of those are 100 pages, but to extract specifically within the document in what areas we see the kind of information and inputs that you have already produced in your national research. So, for example, in the case of Chile, on their adaptation communication, we see, for example, messages around the need of increasing the number of professionals trained in climate science, vulnerability risk, and adaptation to climate change through formal education. So here, and I remember many of you have already indicated similar inputs as the one we are seeing in Chile. Also, for example, Chile presents the concept of scientific research on the impact of climate change on Antarctica and its biodiversity. This will clearly indicate that this is a priority area in terms of territorial and sectorial approaches for Chile. It also speaks about the island territory, specifically Juan Fernandez Archipelago, glaciers and ice fields, the effects of the flowering desert, algae meadows, and the high Andean wetlands. That all are specific concerns that Chile has, and also the need to have additional or initial scientific research in these areas. So it's a very clear message to the international community, but also to the national community in terms of what areas are needed to have a in-depth scientific research. Also to improve the information in relation to the impacts of marine ecosystems and the biodiversity, increases in temperature, acidity, sea level, and wave dynamics. Also to improve meteorological data and biophysical indicators for an integrated network of sensors and data distributed throughout the national territory. And it's something that has also appeared in some of your work, the need to improve meteorological data. For example, Chile here also links that data through to biophysical indicators, so it's a more complex approach, and also this concept of networks of sensors and data distributed across the territory. Also, the increase the knowledge in the field of impacts on agricultural systems, health, studies of disease burden and other types of impacts, cities and infrastructure, strengthen information and sensitivity and capacity of communities and people who are exposed to the threats. There are also, again, priority sectors for Chile in terms of knowledge and capacity that needs to be worked in the next years. And last, recognize the role of the public sector in the generation of knowledge and public-private partnerships. It also speaks to the strategy, the overall strategy, and it's a much more cross-cutting approach to the needs and gaps, where the government of Chile clearly indicates the role of the public sectors, but also the role of public and private sector partnerships. So again, this last input is a much more cross-cutting one, but also signals the way that this implementation and support need to develop. Next slide, please. As a second example of an adaptation communication, in this case from Sudan, on the area of implementation, adaptation, actions, and plan, here we have two different format. As we see in Chile, was much more of a table format, where it includes specific lines of these priorities. In the case of Sudan, we see a much more developed paragraph. And what we see here, the first one is method and tools. There is a need to continue building technical capacity and knowledge about methods and tools, such as impact models for periodically assessing future impacts of climate change and for assessing future vulnerability of the water, agriculture, food security, and health sectors and their implication on national development. And this is very interesting, the way that Sudan phrases. It speaks to many things in this paragraph. First, the priority sectors, water, agriculture, food security, health, also the relationship between these sectors and the national development of the country, but also how to develop these tools and models to, and this is very important, to periodically assess. So there are somehow establishing a priority where there need to fill a gap and need for a model that is ongoing, that is stable throughout the process and can inform periodically. And this will not only assist Sudan in the process of communicating these vulnerabilities, but also in terms of the adaptation policy cycle to, for example, establish new measures, monitor and evaluate those measures in terms of how those measures, adaptation measures, can also apply to the context of these vulnerabilities and impacts. Also, the second issue that Sudan brings to the table is the regional climate scenarios. Sudan says the vulnerability and adaptation assessments conducted during the NAP process following the NAP approach, which is a participatory and consultative process, but focuses only on the short-term climate impacts to address urgent and immediate adaptation needs. Therefore, further development of climate scenarios is necessary to cover all the states of Sudan to identify mid and long-term adaptation needs based on a sound scientific approach, taking into account the needs and circumstances of different stakeholders, including women and men. Also, further follow-up work on introducing impact models and their know-how is vital to use climate scenarios in order to better understand future vulnerabilities of the development sector in Sudan. And again, the second paragraph speaks to a process. Sudan puts in the table the process that they already achieved in their NAPA, and their NAP indicated that they already have assessed short-term impacts and needs, but they need, in order to have a long-term adaptation process, to also include future climate change scenarios and how that can also speak to specific stakeholders and specific regions in Sudan. Next slide, please. This is another example. One is close to my experience, which is Uruguay Cities and Infrastructure National Adaptation Plan. Uruguay has made a sectorial approach to NAPs, and this is one of those NAPs. This has already been presented last year to the convention on a specific chapter on information gaps and capacity building needs for adaptation. Together with Pilar, we extract, this is a one-page chapter that speaks to all the gaps and needs related to adaptation. We have extracted those that are related to the vulnerability and risk assessment. So first, there is the issue to highlight the linkages between climate change and health. And that, of course, speaks to adaptation measures, but also to the impacts and vulnerability assessment process. Also, losses and damages. That is something that Uruguay has also been working on lately, how to establish an ongoing assessment of losses and damage. That, of course, will speak to Article 8 of the Paris Agreement, but also speaks to the impacts in terms of the adaptation communication and the NAPs. Also, climate and meteorological data. There is climate and meteorological data in Uruguay, but indeed there is need to strengthen that and to have a more detailed information and data. In particular, in this NAP for cities and infrastructure, we require very local data to achieve a certain degrees of adaptation. Also, the need to strengthen future scenarios, as the one we were seeing with Sudan. There also analysis on extreme events, also on climate change impacts. And there's two specific subsectors in terms of impacts that are the fire risks. This is something that has occurred lately in Uruguay, that we have droughts, but also an increased risk in fires in terms of forest fires. So the need to have that clearly understood, in particular in surrounding wood areas around cities where the fire risk also expands. And last, another sector, priority sector, is the water risk. That is also something that is quite relevant for cities and infrastructure. Right now, for example, we are living our worst drought in terms of water for consumption at the city. We have not more drinking water in our pipes. We have had to mix that with salt water from the ocean. So it's clearly a risk that was presented at that time, and we need additional information, additional knowledge on that. And we also extract a second part of needs and gaps that speak to cross-cutting issues. One is the technical and professional training, the same as the one we saw from Chile, and also the development of capacity building processes. Next slide, please. Pilar, siguiente slide, por favor. Gracias. Our last example is from Burkina Faso National Adaptation Plan. There is an area specifically speaks about capacity needed. It's a long list that Burkina Faso places. It's very interesting because what Burkina Faso does is that it lists all the needs in relation to different stages of the adaptation policy cycle. Again, in this time we have selected the two specific on the vulnerability and risk assessments, and also an additional 4 that are cross-cutting. The first two it's a database on impacts of climate change for each region of Burkina Faso. This is something that currently Burkina Faso has just a large database, a national one, that is still not detailed and specific. So what they're saying, we need a very specific impact database at each region. And also the climate models on reduced regional scale. So again, you see here a very clear priority that Burkina Faso speaks about. Well, we do have our national adaptation plan, but we need to go on a local and more regional level. So we need to have our impacts and our models on a regional level. And that, again, this is very important as well. And we have discussed this in past meetings, is that we need to put these gaps and need in a context of capacity development and building across the time. So we see in our stage of knowledge, in our stage of planning, we need to go to the next step. And for example, in case of Burkina Faso, is to go at local and regional level. And four, we have also detected four gaps and needs that are more cross-cutting. First, the involvement of government agencies with the General Directorate of Meteorology. And remember, when we were discussing the capacity building model, remember we speak about individuals, organization, and a more systemic approach. In this area that Burkina Faso is telling us is that they perhaps can have a strong methodology agency, but what Burkina Faso is saying is that we don't not only need to strengthen that agency, but also to linkage with other areas of government on a cross-cutting approach. Also, institutional, financial, technical, and material capacity building by the Department of Environment Protection, capacity building of stakeholders involved, and involvement and mobilization of the private sector. It's something similar that we have seen with the case of Chile, where there's also a linkage in terms of capacity building with the private sector. So that will be the four examples we have chosen with Pilar, two from Latin America, two from Africa, just to share with you examples, very concrete examples of the kind of inputs that you have already achieved at your national research process and that you can contribute to the adaptation documents, in this case, the adaptation communication of the NAPs. But again, as Pilar have indicated, we have several adaptation documents, and we can definitely identify our inputs in most of them in our work coming up from you, but also in discussion with the national focal points of the UNFCCC. Many thanks.